The city glittered, a cold tapestry of diamonds laid out under a moonless sky. In the opulent, silent heart of a skyscraper, a different kind of transaction was about to begin. This was not a place for laughter or genuine smiles. It was a theater of power, where the world's wealthiest individuals gathered to trade in the one commodity they believed could be bought: people. Among them sat Griffin, a man carved from ambition and ice. His name was whispered in boardrooms with a mix of fear and reverence. He had built his empire from nothing, and in the process had sealed away any part of himself that was soft or vulnerable. To him, this auction was just another display of dominance, another way to prove that everything and everyone had a price. He watched the proceedings with detached boredom, his sharp eyes missing nothing, yet caring for even less. And then she was led onto the dais. Her name was Octavia. She stood out not because she tried to, but because the very air around her seemed to vibrate with a quiet, desperate dignity. She was not dressed in gaudy finery like the others who had been paraded before the crowd. She wore a simple, elegant dress, and her hands, clenched tightly at her sides, were the only sign of the storm raging within her. Her eyes, a deep and soulful hue, were fixed on a point far away, past the greedy, evaluating stares of the audience. She was thinking of a sterile hospital room, of the beeping of a heart monitor, of a younger brother whose only chance for survival was the unthinkable sacrifice she was making tonight. Griffin sat up. The languid boredom vanished from his posture, replaced by a sudden, predatory focus. He saw the fear she tried so hard to conceal, but more than that, he saw the formidable strength it took for her to stand there at all. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the kindness in the set of her mouth. In a room full of polished mannequins, she was utterly, devastatingly real. The auctioneer's voice cut through the heavy silence, naming a starting bid that was already more money than Octavia had ever seen in her life. Hands went up. Numbers were called. With each raise, Octavia flinched almost imperceptibly, a fresh wave of shame washing over her. Griffin watched it all, his expression unreadable. When the bidding began to slow, Griffin finally moved. He didn't raise a paddle or call out. He simply lifted a single finger, a minute gesture that screamed of absolute authority. He named a figure that doubled the last bid. A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to him, then back to the woman on the stage. A rival bidder, a man with a florid face and cruel eyes, grunted and raised the bid again, a challenge. A ghost of a smile touched Griffin's lips. This was a language he understood. He met the challenge and then surpassed it, his voice cool and clear, each number a hammer blow that silenced the competition. The final amount he named was obscene, a sum that could buy islands. It was a statement. It was a conquest. The auctioneer slammed his gavel. Sold. To Mr. Griffin. The sound echoed in the vast room. Octavia's knees felt weak. It was done. She had been purchased. She was now the property of a stranger, a man known only for his ruthlessness. Griffin rose from his seat and walked toward the dais, his footsteps echoing in the profound silence. He moved with an easy, powerful grace that was both mesmerizing and intimidating. He didn't look at the auctioneer or the stunned crowd. His gaze was locked solely on Octavia. He stopped before her, so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne. He was even more imposing up close, his presence seeming to swallow all the light and air in the room. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture for her to descend from the platform. His eyes, a stormy gray, held hers, and in their depths she saw something unexpected, something that confused her, not cruelty but a deep, burning intensity, a curiosity that felt more dangerous than any leer. He leaned in, his voice a low, intimate whisper meant only for her ears, a whisper that held a strange mix of a command and a plea, a warning and a promise that would forever change the course of her life. Stop me when I go too deep. Without another word he offered his arm. After a heart-stopping moment of hesitation, Octavia, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, placed her trembling hand on it. And with that, he led her away, the ruthless CEO and the bride he had won, leaving the glittering, silent room and its stunned inhabitants behind, stepping out into a future neither of them could possibly predict. The heavy, silent car glided through the night, a sleek capsule of unspoken tension. Inside, Octavia sat as far from Griffin as the spacious leather seats would allow, her body pressed against the cold window. She watched the city lights blur into streaks of gold, each one taking her further from the life she knew. He did not speak. He merely observed her from his side of the car, his profile sharp and unreadable in the intermittent glow of passing street lamps. The whisper he had breathed into her ear, "Stop me when I go too deep," echoed in the silence between them, a cryptic riddle she was too terrified to solve. The car eventually passed through imposing iron gates and traveled down a long, winding driveway, cutting through immaculate gardens that were mere shadows in the darkness. Then the house came into view. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress of glass and steel, a monument to cold, modern wealth, its many windows reflecting the night sky like sightless eyes. The sheer scale of it made Octavia feel smaller than she ever had on the auction dais. A stern-faced housekeeper named Mrs. Higgins met them at the grand entrance, her expression as welcoming as a locked vault. She led Octavia to her rooms, a suite so vast and beautifully appointed it felt like a gilded cage. The door clicked shut with a sound of finality, and Octavia finally allowed the tears to fall, silent and hot, for the freedom she had just sold. The next morning, Griffin summoned her to his study. The room was a physical manifestation of the man himself. Walls of books, a massive desk of dark, polished wood, and a floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over a landscape he seemingly owned. He was not sitting behind the desk, imposing his power, but standing by the window, a silhouette against the bright morning light. He laid out the rules without turning to look at her, his voice flat and transactional. You will remain here for a period of 1 year. Your brother's medical team has been retained. All his expenses, past and future, are settled. A generous allowance has been established in your name. You may have anything you wish for, clothes, books, anything at all. Simply inform Mrs. Higgins. He finally turned, and his gray eyes were as cool and assessing as they had been the night before. The only thing you may not have is your freedom. You will not leave these grounds unaccompanied. These are the terms. Octavia's fear began to curdle into a hot, sharp anger. I am not a pet, she said, her voice trembling only slightly. A ghost of something, amusement perhaps, flickered in his eyes. No. Pets are kept for affection. This is a business arrangement. You provided a service, your presence at the auction. I am providing compensation. Those first days were a battle of silent wills. Octavia tested her boundaries. She wandered the endless hallways, tracing the patterns in the cold marble floors. She explored the library, its shelves stocked with literature far more complex than the simple romance novels she loved. She ate the exquisite meals prepared for her in the cavernous dining room, alone, the clink of her silverware the only sound. Griffin was a ghost in his own home, a presence she felt more than saw. She would sometimes catch a glimpse of him through a doorway, or hear the low murmur of his voice on a business call, but he made no attempt to see her. The change began, as many things do, with a small, almost insignificant crack. One evening, overwhelmed by the oppressive silence, she ventured into the library and selected a book. It was a thick, dense historical text, and she became so engrossed in it that she didn't hear him enter. She was curled in a large armchair, her brow furrowed in concentration, when his voice broke the silence. That historian's thesis is fundamentally flawed, Griffin stated, making her jump. He was leaning against the doorframe, watching her. His primary sources were largely discredited a decade ago. Octavia, startled and defensive, snapped the book shut. And I suppose you're an expert on 18th century European trade routes? On the ones that built fortunes like mine? Yes, he replied, his tone dry. He walked further into the room, selected a different volume from the shelf, and handed it to her. This one is more accurate, though the author has a tiresome habit of moralizing. It was not an invitation, but it was a door left slightly ajar. The next night, he found her in the same chair, reading the book he had suggested. He did not speak to her, but he sat in the chair opposite, reading his own papers. Their silence was no longer empty, it was shared. A few nights later he broke it. Why that particular subject? He asked, not looking up from his documents. Octavia, emboldened by the strange new normalcy, answered truthfully. It's easier to get lost in someone else's past than to think about my own present. He was quiet for a moment, then gave a short, quiet nod as if he understood perfectly. The nightly sessions in the library became a ritual. He would work, she would read. Slowly, carefully, words began to fill the space between them. He would critique her book choices. She would challenge his cynical interpretations of the characters' motivations. He discovered she had a sharp, quick wit hidden beneath her layer of sadness. She discovered that beneath his ruthless exterior was a mind of formidable intelligence, one that could be intrigued by a well-argued point. He began to ask her questions about her life before, not about the auction or her brother's illness, but about what she loved. He learned she had a degree in art history, a fact that seemed to genuinely surprise him. She learned that he had started his first business at 16, with nothing but a relentless drive that had alienated everyone who ever tried to get close to him. One evening he gestured to a beautiful but stark abstract painting on the library wall. "What do you think of it?" "It's technically perfect," Octavia said carefully. "But it has no heart. It doesn't make you feel anything." Griffin studied the painting, then her, his gaze lingering. "Perhaps you're right," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. The fortress walls, made of steel and silence and business arrangements, were not being stormed. They were being patiently, quietly disassembled brick by brick. The spark of something new and fragile, something that was neither fear nor anger, had been lit in the darkness of that gilded cage, and it was growing, warming the cold spaces between them with the gentle, dangerous heat of a dawning connection. The change in the atmosphere of the great, cold house was as subtle and undeniable as the shift in the season outside. The sharp edges of autumn were softening, preparing for winter, and inside, the formal rituals between Griffin and Octavia were softening into something far more personal and perilous. Their conversations in the library had become the anchor of their days, a secret world of words and shared glances built within the mansion's silent walls. The rules of their arrangement were never mentioned again. They hung in the air, a ghost of a contract that felt increasingly distant from the reality unfolding between them. One evening, a violent storm lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the library, the wind howling like a wild thing trying to get in. The electricity flickered and died, plunging the room into a deep, intimate darkness, broken only by the frantic dance of the fire blazing in the hearth. Mrs. Higgins brought in a storm lantern, its golden light carving out a small, warm world in the vast room, leaving the rest in shadow. The absence of artificial light and the roar of the storm outside stripped away the last remnants of their public personas. They sat on the thick rug before the fire, the rulebook of CEO and purchased companion forgotten. They were simply a man and a woman, isolated in a bubble of flickering light. They spoke of things they had never dared before. Octavia spoke of the paralyzing fear of losing her brother, the feeling of being utterly alone in the world with that burden. Griffin, his face all sharp planes and deep shadows in the firelight, spoke of his own past not as a triumphant rise, but as a lonely climb, a life spent building walls to keep from being hurt, only to find himself a prisoner inside them. "It's a strange thing," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that competed with the thunder, "to spend your life acquiring things, building an empire, only to realize you've built a very beautiful, very empty museum." Octavia looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the ruthless billionaire, but the lonely boy he must have been. "It doesn't have to be empty," she whispered. The air between them grew thick and heavy, charged with a tension far more electric than the storm outside. The space separating them on the rug seemed to shrink, pulled inward by an invisible, irresistible force. Griffin reached out, his movements slow, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to pull away. His fingers, warm and sure, brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek, the touch sending a jolt through her entire system. His gaze was intense, questioning. The storm in his gray eyes mirrored the one raging beyond the glass. He leaned in, his face so close she could feel his breath warm on her lips. He paused, a breath away from a kiss, and in that suspended moment, he repeated the whisper that had started it all, his voice husky and raw with a vulnerability she had never heard from him. "Stop me when I go too deep." This time, the words were not a warning from a captor to his captive. They were a plea from a man terrified of his own feelings, asking the one woman who could break him to protect him from himself. It was the last defense of a fortress that had already fallen. Octavia did not stop him. Instead, her eyes, wide and dark in the firelight, held his with a certainty that stole his breath. She closed the infinitesimal distance herself. The kiss was not gentle. It was a conflagration. It was the spark meeting the tinder of all their weeks of suppressed longing, unspoken understanding, and shared loneliness. It was a release and a claiming all at once. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against him, and she melted into the solid strength of him, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer still. The world outside, the storm, the auction, the contract, the past, ceased to exist. There was only the heat of his mouth, the taste of him, the feel of his heart hammering against her own. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, the world rushed back in, but it was a different world. The lines had been irrevocably crossed. He stood, his chest rising and falling rapidly, and without a word, he held out his hand. She placed her hand in his, and he led her from the library, not as a CEO leading his acquisition, but as a man leading the woman he desired to his private sanctuary. The intimacy that followed was a silent, profound conversation. It was a frantic, spicy exploration of skin and scent and sensation, a desperate attempt to bridge the final gap between them. But it was also achingly tender. In the dark of his bedroom, with only the moon struggling through the storm clouds for light, there were no more masks. There was only Griffin, the man, laying himself bare before her, his touch a reverent question and her response a fervent answer. It was a surrender not of one to the other, but of both to the terrifying, glorious thing growing between them. The deep he had warned her about was no longer a place of danger, but the very core of him, and she plunged into it willingly, finding not darkness, but a belonging she had never known. When they finally lay spent and entwined in the quiet aftermath, the storm outside had passed, and a new, more profound tempest had been born within them, binding them together in the warm, tangled silence. The morning after the storm dawned clear and brilliant, the world outside the windows washed clean and sparkling. But the true transformation was inside the cold, steel and glass mansion. A new, palpable energy hummed in the air, a warmth that seemed to have melted the very frost from the windows. Griffin was a man reborn. The stern, unapproachable CEO had vanished, replaced by a version of himself that was both startling and intoxicating. His smiles, once rare and fleeting, were now given freely, his eyes soft and full of a quiet wonder whenever they rested on Octavia. The fortress had not just been breached, it had been joyfully abandoned. He was no longer her warden, but her devoted suitor. He began to orchestrate their days with a fierce, possessive tenderness. He had breakfast with her on the sun-drenched terrace, his hand finding hers across the table. He cancelled high-stakes meetings to walk with her through the manicured gardens, his arm a constant, solid weight around her waist, his head bent to listen to her talk about art or books or the simple, silly thoughts that crossed her mind. He was, for the first time in his adult life, truly present. The most profound change came when he accompanied her to the hospital. Octavia had been nervous, unsure how the powerful, intimidating Griffin would fit into the sterile, fragile world of her brother's illness. But he was perfect. He didn't try to take over or dominate the space. He stood back, a silent, supportive pillar, speaking to the doctors with a quiet authority that ensured they received the very best attention. He treated her brother not as a patient or a problem, but as a person, engaging him in conversations about video games and sports, making the boy laugh with a genuine, easy warmth that made Octavia's heart ache. Seeing the two most important people in her life connect was a gift she had never dared to dream of. In those moments, the last remnants of the auction, of the contract, seemed to dissolve into a beautiful, forgotten dream. Yet, as the days melted into weeks, a different, colder feeling began to take root in the fertile soil of Octavia's happiness. It was a seed of doubt, watered by the very perfection of their new life. In the quiet moments when Griffin was working and she was alone, the questions would creep in, insidious and sharp-clawed. Was this love real? Or was it just a beautiful byproduct of their bizarre circumstances? He had bought her. He had paid a fortune for her. He held all the power, controlled every aspect of her life. Was her love for him a genuine, free-felt emotion, or was it a form of survival, a natural attachment to the man who had saved her brother and shown her kindness? Was she like a bird in a gilded cage, singing a grateful song for the one who held the key, mistaking dependency for devotion? The thought festered. Every tender look from him, every gentle touch, began to feel like a link in a chain she had willingly helped to forge. The memory of his whisper, "Stop me when I go too deep," now felt like a prophecy she had foolishly ignored. She had gone too deep. She had given him her heart, her body, her soul, while the fundamental power dynamic between them had never changed. He owned her. And how could love truly exist where there was no true freedom? The fear grew, a cold knot in her chest that even his warmest embrace could not melt. She saw the way the household staff looked at her, not with disdain but with a knowing pity. The purchased bride. She started to pull away, her smiles becoming strained, her laughter a little too forced. She would find excuses to leave the room when he entered, needing space to breathe, to think. Griffin noticed, of course. He was a man who noticed everything. The softness in his eyes began to be tinged with confusion, then with a flicker of panic. He tried to pull her closer, his gestures of affection becoming more intense, as if he could physically hold on to the happiness that was slipping through his fingers. But his efforts only made her feel more trapped, more like a cherished possession. The breaking point came one evening as they stood on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues. He stood behind her, his arms wrapped tightly around her, his chin resting on her head. "I've never been this happy," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. And in that moment, surrounded by his love, Octavia felt the walls of her gilded cage close in around her. She knew then what she had to do. It was the bravest, most terrifying decision of her life. She had to know if his love was for the woman she was, or for the acquisition he had made. She gently extricated herself from his embrace and turned to face him, her expression a mask of pained resolve. "Griffin," she began, her voice trembling but clear. It can't continue like this. I love you. I think you know that. But I can't stay here living this life knowing it all started with a price tag. I need you to choose me because you want to, not because you own me. And I need to choose you back completely free." She took a shaky breath, her heart shattering as she saw the stunned hurt in his eyes. I need to leave." The silence that fell between them after Octavia's words was heavier and more profound than any that had existed in the house before their first kiss. It was a silence filled with the crumbling of a shared dream. Griffin stared at her, the color draining from his face, the softness in his eyes freezing into a pane of shocked, uncomprehending ice. He did not argue. He did not rage. He simply stood there on the balcony, the dying embers of the sunset at his back, as if her words had been a physical blow, robbing him of speech, of breath, of everything. Without a word, he turned and walked back into the house. The sound of the balcony door closing behind him was the sound of a final chapter ending. The following days were a study in gray emptiness. Octavia moved through the vast rooms like a ghost, her small suitcase packed and sitting by the door of her gilded suite, a silent monument to her resolve. Griffin disappeared. He was a ghost in his own home, a presence felt only in the slamming of a distant door or the low, urgent murmur of his car pulling away at dawn. Mrs. Higgins moved with a pinched, disapproving expression, the very air of the house thick with a tension so sharp it felt like it could draw blood. Octavia's heart was a constant, physical ache in her chest. She had chosen the brutal possibility of an honest future over the beautiful lie of a comfortable present, and the cost was a pain so deep she wondered if she would ever feel whole again. A week passed. Then, on a morning shrouded in a soft, misty rain, Mrs. Higgins came to her. "Mr. Griffin requests your presence in the study," she said, her voice devoid of its usual chill, laced instead with something almost resembling anticipation. Octavia's heart hammered against her ribs as she walked the now familiar path to his study. This was it. He would formally release her. The contract would be terminated. She would walk out of his life forever. She pushed the heavy door open, expecting to find him behind his desk, the CEO once more. He was not at his desk. He was standing in the center of the room, looking not powerful and imposing, but strangely vulnerable. He wore a simple sweater and dark trousers, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His face was pale, etched with the evidence of sleepless nights, but his eyes held a new raw clarity. "Octavia," he said, her name a quiet sigh on his lips. He didn't move toward her. Instead, he gestured to the low table between them. On it lay a single, familiar document, the original, brutally clinical contract from the auction. Next to it was a simple, elegant silver lighter. "Do you remember what I told you?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "I told you that you could have anything you wanted except your freedom." He paused, his gaze locking with hers, and in that look she saw the entirety of his soul laid bare. "I was wrong. I was a fool." He picked up the contract, the paper that had defined their relationship, that had given him the right to her life. He held it out to her. "This is the last barrier between us. The last reminder of how we began." Then he flicked the lighter. A small, determined flame sprang to life. He touched it to the corner of the document. For a moment, it smoldered, and then, with a hungry rush, the flame caught, curling the edges, turning the words that had bound her to ash. He dropped the burning pages into a large crystal ashtray on the table, and they watched together, mesmerized as the past was consumed by fire, the embers glowing orange before fading to black. "The deal," Griffin said, his voice thick with emotion, "is over. You are free. You have always been free to leave from this very moment. No conditions. No strings." He stepped around the dying embers, closing the distance between them. He did not touch her, but stood before her, a man pleading his case not with power, but with profound humility. "But my love for you is not a deal. It is not a transaction. It is the most real, the most permanent thing I have ever possessed. I don't want to own you, Octavia. I want to belong to you. I want to build a life with you, not as my kept bride, but as my partner, my wife, my equal. I'm asking you to stay. Not because you have to, but because you choose to. Choose me. Choose us." Tears streamed freely down Octavia's face, but they were tears of release, of a joy so profound it could only be expressed through this salty, cathartic rain. The cage was gone. The bars had been melted in that very fire. All that remained was the man, offering her not a gilded prison, but his heart, his future, his forever. She did not answer with words. She closed the final, small gap between them, her hands coming up to cradle his face, her thumbs stroking the weary lines beside his eyes. She looked into the stormy gray depths, seeing her future, her home, her love reflected back at her. And then she kissed him. It was a kiss of acceptance, of promise, of a choice made not from necessity, but from the deepest, truest part of her soul. It was a seal on their new beginning. He held her as if he would never let go, his arms wrapping around her, lifting her from the ground in a fierce, joyous embrace. The forever they had both secretly craved but never dared to name had finally begun, not with a contract but with a choice, forged in the ashes of the past and burning brighter than any flame. Their story is far from over. If you've been swept away by Griffin and Octavia's journey from a cold auction to a burning, forever love, there are countless more stories of passion, drama, and romance waiting for you. Subscribe to the channel for more tales of hearts challenged and one, of love that conquers all. Don't miss the next unforgettable romance. Subscribe now.